Well, that's an auspicious beginning. I'm Jim Rambo, and welcome all. Good to see a good turnout today. And because it's not raining outside or inside today, I'd like you to sing out with me, because it's Sunday morning, with great exuberance. Happy birthday to me. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, old Rambo. Happy birthday to you.
I must share.
Yes.
We share a birthday.
Oh, congratulations. I today turn 83. Still hanging in there. And that's 15 months older than Joe Biden. So, if during my campaign this morning to make you smile or maybe make you laugh out loud, I do some flailing about, you'll understand why now.
Just don't run for president.
It was 1971, more than 50 years ago, when Governor Russell Peterson of Delaware, in his infinite wisdom, appointed me a judge. I was appointed a judge in a lower court called the Magistrates Court, or Justice of the Peace Court, where minor matters are generally heard. Yes, I wore a robe. Yes, I sat up on a bench and enjoyed every minute of it. But I only lasted about 9 months or so on the bench because I found something a little more interesting to do later. While I was on the bench, I had an incident in the middle of the night. A man came in, and the policeman said, "Hey, we have a guy that was doing 95 miles an hour, Judge, going down the highway." And, you know, I was very concerned because of that speed. You know, what was he doing? So I asked him, and he said he was going to his next gig. And he brought him into the courtroom, and I'm up on the bench, and the man says, "Yes, I admit I really was going 95 miles an hour because I really did have to go to my next gig." So I asked the policeman, I said, "What's the man's name?" He said, "Herman Woody." And I said, "Well, Mr. Woody, just a minute, Mr. Woody." I said, "You were going to your next gig and you're Herman Woody?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "I don't think so. I think the policeman made a little mistake. I think you're Woody Herman. And your Thundering Herd is your band." And he said, "Yep, that's me." And I said, "Woody, just slow the hell down. You're in Delaware. You're not going to be going 95 miles an hour. But tonight you're going to plead guilty to going 1 mile an hour over the speed limit, and get your butt out of here and stop speeding." Well, Woody had a big smile on his face, and he was a very thankful man, and a very fine man at that. I also hold, if I may pump myself up just a little bit, I hold a record that will, I suggest, never ever be broken in the state of Delaware. Well, what could that possibly be? Well, it's a judicial record. I was in court one night, and a constable came to me, and he said, "Judge, I just got a new pair of handcuffs." And he said, "Do you mind if I try them on you?" And I said, "No, I don't mind at all." So the constable puts the handcuffs on me, and as I'm looking at him, he gets this very, very strange look on his face. I said, "What's going on?" He said, "I left the key at the other court," which was a half hour away. So here I am with a crowd of people getting ready to have their cases heard out in the hall, and I've got a set of handcuffs on. So I said, "Well, what do you suggest I do, Constable?" And he said, "Here, cases." So I went up on the bench, put my hands down like this, and heard at least 3 cases while I was handcuffed. Now, if those poor folks that were seated out in front of me knew that their judge was handcuffed, they would have sworn that I was out of my mind. But I really had no choice in the matter, no choice at all. We had a judge in the Superior Court, a higher court, who was a wonderful, wonderful man. I think when he passed away, he left a lot of money to his secretary. He was just that kind of a judge, not your normal judge, if you will. And he had a way of speaking that was very unusual. And I had it down pat. I had the honor of speaking and giving a eulogy for him in a courtroom after his death. And they asked me to do the eulogy because I could do it in his voice. And let me tell you what his voice sounded like. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Judge Stiftel of the Superior Court. And what do you have to say for your miserable self? He had a way of having fun with people. We had a defendant named Northeast West, of all strange names. And Northeast West was in a lot of trouble when he went before Judge Stiftel. And Judge Stiftel, finally, after hearing all the evidence concerning Northeast West, looked at him sternly and said, "Well, Northeast West, I think today you're going south." Which was the direction of the Delaware Correctional Center. One man came in, he was fit to be tied because he was hungry and he'd been in jail for the weekend. I think it was a Monday morning. And he was complaining to everybody on the way in. He was a real complainer. I didn't like this, I didn't like that. You know, this jail is no good. What's Delaware going to take pride in this kind of a jail? So the judge looked down at him as he was complaining and said, "Would somebody go and get this man a Tootsie Roll?" One final matter with Judge Stiftel involved a Delaware engineer, if you will. Well, he was a DuPont engineer, and he had a pocket protector that probably had at least 15 pencils and pens in it. And he was a very particular kind of an engineer, as engineers tend to be. And he came into court and he complained that he had been charged with speeding unnecessarily so. And he was doing a great deal of speed. And he contested every damn thing that the policeman said about his speeding. He had nothing good to say. So, as one is wont to do in those circumstances, he asked for, believe it or not, and it never ever happened, he asked for a jury trial on his speeding case. The jury trial, because he had his way of doing things, lasted 2 full days on a speeding charge. And the jury was just frustrated as they could be with all of his arguments about solar energy, about speeding. He had his slide rule out, he was measuring this, measuring that, asking the policeman about the various equipment that the policeman was using. So finally, after 2 days, the trial was over, the jury came back, and not to anyone's surprise, the jury found this DuPont engineer guilty as charged. Well, as soon as the engineer heard that he was guilty as charged in front of the jury, he stood up and he started complaining again. I don't think this jury was a fair-minded jury. It was a biased jury. You know, I'm really concerned about justice in the state of Delaware. Judge Stiftel looked at him and in his amused way said to the man, "Well, if I were you, I'd just pretend I just think about all the times that I was speeding and I didn't get caught, and then I'll feel better. Sometimes I needed to make a little extra money because I was on the state dole, if you will, as a prosecutor. And so I took on arbitration cases during my lunch hour. It was a nice way to make $300 during a lunch hour. So I would sit in my office, the attorneys would bring their clients into my office, and we would hear their cases as I was the arbitrator. And I'm guessing the year was probably 1975, 1980 or so. 1980 probably. One day I had a case come in before me, and I'm seated behind my desk, and it's an elderly couple, or the plaintiffs. The defendant didn't even show up, just his lawyer. And the defense lawyer said to me, well, Judge, we're not going to contest liability. These folks were in their car. They weren't bothering anybody. They're stopped at a red light, and my client did run into them, hit them from behind. So we're not contesting liability at all. The only issue today is damages. What are these folks claiming, and whether it's fairly claimed? So I smiled back at them, happy not to have to make a decision concerning liability. And the elderly couple was just the sweetest couple you would ever know. The kind of couple that sits next to you on a Sunday morning in church. They were very, very nice people, and the lady was very demure. So I sat there and I listened to the case for maybe, I'm saying probably 40 minutes or so. I heard all their complaints. I heard all the problems with the man. I heard all the problems with the lady. And finally, when the case was over, we adjourned, and the lady, who could barely get out of her chair, stood up slowly and she said, Judge, nobody heard my case. Nobody heard what my complaint is. And I'm looking at her and I'm saying, well, ma'am, you have an open forum here. Please make yourself heard. And she said, well, I just want you to know that before you decide on the money in this case, he can't do it in positions no more. Well, that brought a terrible image to my mind. And unfortunately, that image remained in my mind for many weeks after that hearing. I did give her a little bit of money for it. One of the strange things about being in the courtroom is that there are so many people who come in with odd names. And ain't it strange for a guy named Rambo to say that they come in with strange names? But many of them do. Even till today, they do. So I went to a convention in Chicago, ran into some other prosecutors at the convention, and I said to one of the prosecutors during a break in the proceedings, I have some strange names, and I think my names are more strange than your Chicago names. Convention was in Chicago. He said, get out of here. You know how many people live in Chicago? Do you realize what your odds are coming from Delaware to have a strange name that's more strange than anything I can provide? And I said, yeah, I understand that, but I have one for you anyway. He said, go ahead, go ahead. So I said, I had a defendant in a case once. His name was a mean guy. Middle Eastern fellow named a mean guy. So I said to the attorney in Chicago, can you imagine the fun I had in summation? You're going to find this guy guilty. You know why? Because he's a mean guy. He said, well, you know, that's so-and-so, that's kind of iffy, he said to me. And I said, well, I have another one for you. So I'm going to put 2 against your 1. He said, because I'm from Delaware and it's a small state, I'm going to put 2 against your 1. And he said, go with it. I said, okay, how about this one? A mere facade. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this whole case has been a mere facade. And of course the jury enjoyed every moment of that. The guy from Chicago looks at me and he said, I got you. I said, get out of here. You can't come up with a name better than those 2. And he said, I can. I said, well, give it a shot. He said, okay. He said, I had a defendant in a case once here in Chicago. His name was Zippity Doo Dah Day. I looked at him, I said, get the hell out of here. He said, I swear. He said, do I have you topped? And I said, well, maybe so. And he said, well, that's not the end of the story. And I said, there can be more to that story, Zippity Doo Dah Day. And he said, yeah. He said, he didn't show up to court one morning, so what the hell was I going to do? He said, I called him at home. He said, a woman answered the phone and she said, and he said, I said to her, is Zippity Doo Dah Day there? And she said, would that be senior or junior? I said, I give up, you got me. Zippity doo dah, zippity yay. My, oh my, it was a wonderful day. Plenty of sunshine heading my way. Zippity doo dah, zippity yay. From Song of the South, 1946, a Disney produced film, which they will not release anymore because it contains so many negative racial stereotypes. So you'll never see Song of the South on the screen, either on TV or in the movies. I can't remember the guy's name, a defendant in a burglary case. I can't remember his name, so let's just call him Mr. Ellison, okay? Because I can't think of another name.
I object, Your Honor.
I know there's here somewhere.
That'll be denied.
Order in the court.
He was charged with a burglary in Dover, Delaware, and he was representing himself in connection with this case, as we say, pro se. And he decided, for better or worse, to take the stand in his own defense. So as he was up on the stand, I was cross-examining him, and I said, you know, Mr. Ellison, where were you on the night of the 14th of December of this year? And he said, I take the 5th. Not F-I-F-T-H, F-I-F-F. I take the 5th. So I said, okay, sir. The jury's sitting there wrapped at attention. So I said, Mr. Ellison, isn't it true that you pawned some items on the morning after this burglary and got $100 for them? And he looked at me and he said, I take the 5th. Jury's looking, like, what the heck is going on here? And I'm saying what's going on. I asked him another question about that night, where his car was that night, and he responded in the same way. I take the 5th. So I wandered around a little bit as I'm wandering now, and I looked at him and I said, Mr. Ellison, what is the 5th? And he said, I don't know, but I'm taking it. The jury roared laughing as he said, "I don't know, but I'm taking it," and then rapidly found him guilty. We had a new Attorney General one year, which is always a cause for celebration. It was within the ranks, and always cause for concern because we never knew where he was coming from. His name was Carl Danberg, and Carl was a really fine Attorney General. Not as fine as some others perhaps, but he was really a good man. And he was being introduced to the Attorney General's staff on what we called then the Friday morning meeting. So on Friday mornings, somewhere between 40 and 50 prosecutors would be seated around the outside of a large conference room and also around the side of a large table within that conference room. It was one of those Friday mornings, and I was seated behind my desk before the Friday morning meeting, and two of my friends named Vella and O'Connor came in. Vella and O'Connor were known as fun people. So they looked at me and they called me Rammy. They said, "Rammy, we'd like to have a good time this morning, and here's what we'd like to try." So they tried out a proposition with me, and I, of course, because it was a Friday morning and I was a happy kind of guy, I said, "I'm with you. Let's give it a try." So the meeting's about 15 minutes later. All the prosecutors come running into the meeting, take their chairs around the table, around the outside. The whole room was named for one of my great friends, Stuart Sklut. And we sat around Sklut's room, if you will. And I was seated, and the new Attorney General came in, and he was introduced by Steve Wood, the state prosecutor, as your new Attorney General. And I'd like you to let him understand who we are, what we're about, and we're going to live up to his expectations. And everybody's nodding and shaking their head. So the presentation was made about the new Attorney General and all that he did expect, which was nothing more than do the right thing in all your cases. That's what's expected. O'Connor gets up, my friend O'Connor, who came in my office early that morning, and he says to the crowd, "Rammy, I'd like you to address the group this morning." I looked at him in a strange way. He said, "You've done these murder trials. We've watched you. You've done these rape trials. We've watched you. And we've admired the way you've done them. And I'd like, just because there are a number of new people in the room this morning, new prosecutors, I'd like you to address them and tell them what your best legal advice for them is." So I nodded. And then, of course, Vella gets up, and he does the same pitch. "Rammy, O'Connor's right. You're the man. Stand up, tell these kids what it's about. These new guys need to know if they're going to prosecute cases and be effective with what they're doing." And he said, "I'd like you to stand, if you will, just as you've been requested, and give them your best legal advice." So with that kind of an introduction in front of 40 to 50 prosecutors, many of whom had as much experience as I stood and I shook my head and I said, "Well, I've considered all those cases, and I've considered all those trials and tribulations, and I have one bit of legal advice, just one." And they all looked at me and I said, "If you're in a bad marriage, get the hell out of it." I sat down, and the new Attorney General just went, because he had an inkling then of what he was in for. And he was right. Had a damn good friend, and I say had because he's gone now. His name was Tommy Little. And Tommy and I had a lot in common, especially when it came to having a sense of humor about these things in the law. He was a high school teacher. He was a Philly guy. He was born and raised in Philly. He was a Marine. He taught all Marines judo, jiu-jitsu. He was a state representative in Delaware, and he was a high school teacher. So he had a hell of a lot of background to him. And I appreciated his experience and the things that he could impart to me as a prosecutor. So he said to me one day, you know, I know you have this trial coming up, and it's a serious murder trial. It involved the killing of a Catholic priest. And the priest was murdered in Canby Woods in Wilmington, Delaware. He was simply walking through the woods, and he was shot and killed by an assailant. That assailant was on trial, and Tommy Little, my friend, wanted to be part of it. So he said to me, Jim, do you mind if I act as co-counsel? And I said, Tommy, with your experience, I'd love to have you help out. And so Tommy joined me in the prosecution of this ne'er-do-well. He was convicted, of course, because the weapon was found in his drawer in a nearby apartment house. It was confirmed that he had been the shooter, and so obviously the guilt phase of that trial went like that. He was found guilty very rapidly. And so it was time for the penalty phase. Was he going to face the death penalty, which we had in Delaware at that time, lethal injection? And so we had the hearing, and Tommy turns to me and he says, Jim, he said, this is your case. You're the one that's going to do the summation in this death penalty. And so I stood up to address the jury, and I did my best to tell them why death was the only option. In my serious, very serious way at that time, I told them that this man had killed a Catholic priest. He had shown no remorse whatsoever, and it was time to show him how we all felt about it. As I was speaking, one juror started to cry. And I thought to myself, boy, I made a mistake. I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen. We were the defense attorneys. We were not the prosecutors. So Tommy joined me as defense attorney. And so as I was giving my summation, pleading and saying that this guy should not die, well, it's been more than 50 years, Linda. Give me a break. As I was giving my speech to the jury in summation, I said, this man should not die. He'll never sit in front of another fireplace at Christmas time. He'll never see his children again. He'll never celebrate birthdays again. A second juror started to cry. And I said, damn, I got something going here now. I got these people in the palm of my hand, and we're not going to be looking at a death penalty, even though that our client is a no-good SOB. Okay? So I went on making more arguments, and wouldn't you know it, a third juror started to cry. And I said, this is all over. I said, we got this in the bag. They're not going to come back with a death penalty because they're all crying based on my arguments. So I turned around to smile at my co-counsel, and my co-counsel was like this. The jury wasn't crying because of my argument. They were crying because Tom Little was there crying in back of me. My competent co-counsel. He was such a character. He once showed me his handgun. He was living in Dover at the time in an apartment next to the lake. And he showed me his handgun and he said, how do you like this one? How do you like that? He said, this thing is really, really effective. I said, Tom, I'm not a handgun kind of guy. You know, if you are, that's fine. Do your thing. He said, well, someday you'll know why I have it. And I said, okay, someday will come. On a Christmas morning, I was seated on the veranda of my house went on Facebook, and I went to Tom Little's page because he was a Facebook friend of mine. And in capital letters, I saw the word bang. B-A-N-G. And I knew that Tom Little had taken his own life. That was his way of letting me know in a Tom Little kind of way. You know, jury selection is a difficult process, and as I look out at all of your smiling faces this morning, I can remember all the smiling faces of jurors as they came in to be chosen or not chosen for jury duty. And it was quite a process in Delaware, but the judge was in charge. Unlike in many states, the lawyers have a chance to ask the questions of potential jurors. In Delaware, we lawyers did not have that opportunity. It was the judge's call. So one day, I had another, unfortunately, a homicide case. And a man comes in, he was a typical lower, slower, kind of Delaware guy. And he sat up on the chair next to the bench. He took his seat. He had a great big belt buckle on him. He was wearing jeans. He was wearing a flannel shirt. And he had a cholo in his mouth. And the judge looked down at him and said, "Sir, you've been asked to serve in this case. Is there any reason at all in the world that you think that you'll not be able to serve? Or do you have any preconceived ideas about this defendant that's seated here next to me?" And the juror looked at him and said, "Yeah, I got an idea." The judge said, "What's your idea?" And he said, "Hang him." The judge said, "You're excused, sir." In another case, another homicide case, a different judge, Judge Goldstein was the judge that day. He called up a juror who had raised his hand and said, "I don't think I can serve on this jury." Judge Goldstein calls him up, and the lawyers huddled next to Judge Goldstein. And the man said, "There's no way in the world I can be a juror in this case." Judge says, "Well, give us your story, sir." He said, "I hate all black people." Terrible to hear. "I hate all black people, and I hate this guy Rambo." The guy was tattooed all over his chin, all over his face, all over his hands and arms. The judge said, "Well, you're excused too, sir. Go sit down." After he goes and sits down, Judge Goldstein turns to me and says, "Well, Jim, at least he's an equal opportunity hater." So jury selection is not an easy process. Marcia wants to have me tell a story about the case I had. I call it the Johnson case. One of the sisters involved in the case was Ophelia Johnson, and the other sister was Pat Johnson. It was in the family court of Delaware, and it was a case review day. When I went into case review, there were a bunch of people, as many as are seated here today, and they were all waiting to have their cases decided maybe before trial, because they didn't want their cases to go to trial. So these folks are all sitting out there, and I opened my file in front of me, and I said, "Oh my God, this cop is either the most stupid cop I have ever known, or he has the greatest sense of humor of any policeman who ever lived." As I read into the case, the charge read as follows. Pat Johnson did commit theft misdemeanor. She would have been charged with theft felony, except the item involved was only, well, it was a misdemeanor trial. To wit, Pat did steal one dildo belonging to her sister, Ophelia Johnson. I called Ophelia up to the desk to ask her what the case was really about, and she said, well, isn't it plain enough on the complaint? Her name should have been Karen, I guess, huh? Isn't it clear enough what the case is about? My dildo was stolen. I said, well, how do you know it was stolen? She said, well, I put it in the dishwasher, and when the dishwasher was finished washing the dishes, my dildo was gone. I said, and that's how you know what this case is about? She said, yes, and I know damn well it was my sister that did it because that's the way she is. I said, you mean your sister Pat, seated out here? She said, yes, that's my sister. So I called Pat up and I said, Pat, what is going on? You know, is your sister crazy? Does she know what cross-examination is going to be like in court if this goes to trial? Can you imagine her being cross-examined about her dildo in a court trial in the family court? Oh my gosh. So Pat says, no, Mr. Rambo, come with me. I'll explain it all. So she calls me outside of the courthouse. And she calls me over to a car, and she looks in the car and she says, Mom, and her mother's seated in the front seat and says, Mr. Rambo, I'm the one who took that dildo. She said, my daughter, my other daughter, Pat, was charged wrongfully. She said, this policeman didn't know what the hell he was doing. I said, maybe he did know what he was doing. You know, that guy, he had a sense of humor. He put me on the spot. So I told Pat to get in the car with her mother, and I said, get the hell out of here. You know, the family court doesn't have time for this kind of case. So, I never attended an autopsy. I'm not a scientist, I'm a lover. So I never believed in attending autopsies. It wasn't necessary. You've got all the photos. They take photos at autopsy. I used photos in evidence at murder trials. I didn't need to sit in and watch an autopsy to do that. It was unnecessary. But many strong kind of prosecutors who thought that was important, that people know that, that I attended an autopsy, and I can take that. I said, okay. We had the one medical examiner, his name was Dr. Ingito, and I know my good friend Edgar will forgive me for saying this, but Dr. Ingito was from the Philippines, or as he called them, the Philippines. Dr. Ingito was in Wilmington, and we were trying cases in Dover. So one morning, the jury is seated there, and I've gone through a lot of evidence, and it's time for Dr. Ingito to come. And he's not here, so I tell the jury, you know, Dr. Ingito's in Wilmington. He'll have to come, he has to come down here, so maybe he's running just a little bit late. And the jurors nodded, and they said, yeah, that's fine, that's fine. So we waited about an hour and a half. It was only a 45-minute ride. We waited about an hour and a half for Dr. Ingito, the medical examiner, to appear to prove our case. Dr. Ingito walks in, he has striped pants and a checkered sport coat on. And he walks down the aisle toward the witness stand. And he sits down. And I want to placate the jury just a little bit about this wait thing. An hour and a half, you know. I said, Dr. Ingito, would you be kind enough to just let the jury understand why it is that, you know, we're starting an hour and a half to 2 hours late? And Dr. Ingito looked at the jury and he said, what you think, I fly? And Dr. Judy was the other medical examiner in Sussex County. I could never get her into court on time because she always had to have her hair done before she appeared in court. She chased many a cop out of her operating room, if you will, by snacking during the autopsy. Many a cop just had to run out and leave it. No, I never met Joe Biden. I was in Delaware when Joe was in Delaware. We went to the same school at around the same time. He went to a high school across the street from me. He ran for office in Delaware, and I ran for office in Delaware in 1974. We were both people who represented criminal defendants. He did, and I did. But I never met Joe Biden. Hence the chapter in my book, which I wrote about 10 years ago, called, "Why Don't I Know Jack About Joe?" And to this day, I've never met Joe Biden. Well, there are always a few, yes, a few voyeurs in the group. So I'm sure that you are no exception. So I know there are a few voyeurs, and they're usually seated in the back somewhere. So if I'm looking at you, it means you're probably guilty. I hear the question from the voyeur coming from the group. Did you ever sleep with a judge? Did you ever take the judge's robes off and sleep with him or her? And I just looked at that person asking that question. But there was another question that came from the same group in the back. Another voyeur asked the question, did you ever have a juror after a murder trial call you on the phone and say, I'd love to have lunch with you, and then maybe we can do some things after lunch. I really enjoyed your presentation and your cross-examination of that criminal defendant, so maybe we could get together. And I give those voyeurs in the back the same answer that you all know. I take the fifth.
Okay, everybody, you want to cross-examine him, anybody? Okay.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Before my question, I just want to compliment you on that fine ass you have. Right on the front of your shirt there, I love those. You know?
Thank you, sir.
I'm just wondering about the man that killed the priest. What was the verdict?
The verdict was guilty as charged, and he suffered the death penalty. In spite of the 3 jurors crying, which we now know why they were crying, in spite of that, they still found him guilty. I mean, if you kill a priest and you're not sentenced to death in Delaware, you've done something really remarkable. Any other questions? Oh, one on the back.
Hello.
Hello.
Vijay Nilekani. I had a question. Did you ever have anything to do with the Thomas Capano murder trial in Delaware? It was a very, very high-profile murder case in Delaware.
Like, what was the name?
Thomas Capano.
I had a lot to do with it in the sense of advising. I was not counsel of record in that case. We had one federal prosecutor and one friend of mine, a state prosecutor, who's now a judge in Delaware. Ferris Wharton was his name. Ferris, a very fine prosecutor, was involved in the Capano case, as was the federal prosecutor who was involved. But only to the extent that I conferred with them about the case outside the courtroom did I take any part in that at all. Yes, ma'am.
Jim.
Mr. Ellison.
I take the fifth. Is there one great regret you have?
Yeah. My wife, Linda,
You said that thing about bad marriage.
my wife, Linda knows of my great regret.
Oh, I thought she was the.
Is that better?
Anybody else?
I was once involved in as far as the regret goes, I was once involved as a defense attorney for a defendant who was only in a car when the murder occurred inside a doctor's home. His wife was shot and killed. But my client was just the driver of the car. He didn't go into the home. He didn't shoot and kill anybody. But of course, since he was a driver, and in Delaware you have accomplice liability, he was charged and convicted as well. So he was charged and convicted of murder, and he got sentenced to life without probation, parole in Delaware. I was a prosecutor later in my career, and he wrote to me and told me about his cause and his efforts to get out of jail after 40 years of spending time in jail for being the driver, who didn't have a gun, who didn't know there was going to be a murder, who didn't know anything except that his friend was going to go in and burglarize a doctor's home for drugs. And so I took up that man's cause as a prosecutor, much to the chagrin perhaps of some of my fellow prosecutors, because I felt that he deserved to be out of jail after 40 years. So I worked on his behalf, to the surprise of a lot of people, to get him out. And I finally got the Board of Pardons to grant him a pardon after 40 years. The only thing left to do was to allow the parole board to finally give it their okay. Went before the parole board, went to Texas. After that, on vacation, my wife and I were on vacation. I got a call, and they said that they had turned him down after 40 years at the parole board. And I cursed and swore at the guy who was the chairman of the parole board. And I said, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" And he said, "Well, Jim, I think he only needed 2 more years in jail." I said, "What the hell, David, is 2 more years in jail going to do to a man who's been in for 40 years for driving a getaway car?" And he said, "Well, I promise you when you come back in 2 years that I'll take care of it." And I said, "You know, you're too late, David." And David is a Facebook friend of mine to this day. I said, "You're too late, David. You're not thinking straight. You're just trying to kiss everyone's ass in the family of the victim." So, you know, that's the way that went that day. And Bob died in prison right after that call in Texas that we got. So he never had a chance to get out. He had told me a number of times that he was going to be taken through that front door of the prison in a box. And he was right. And so I regret to this day the fact that I was unable to get his release earlier, thanks to David Henderson, who was the chairman of the Board of Parole. I guess I didn't do a good enough job. I regret that.
On a more upbeat note, what is the thing that you're most proud of, or the thing that you consider your legacy for your life? What's your proudest moment?
Well, one very proud moment I had was when I approached a woman on the street in Wilmington one day. I approached her on the street, and she was still a prosecutor. I was retired, and I had come back to Delaware on a visit with friends. And this prosecutor was walking down the street, and she said, Jim, come on over here. I have something to tell you." I said, "Yeah, what could that be?" And she said, "I just want you to know, I took your advice. I was in a bad marriage, and I got the hell out of it."
Thank you so much, everybody.